somebody asked me, what is it exactly you're doing at annual conference? And the short answer to that question is, it's a business meeting. It is a church business meeting that lasts for 2.5 days, not including the setup time and the takedown time. During the final sermon that Bishop Weaver gave, Bishop Sharma Lewis, who is the Bishop of Virginia, has been on medical leave. And so Bishop Weaver, who is retired and was living in Williamsburg, came out of retirement in order to fill in for this interim period. And in his closing sermon, he made an allusion to one of the earliest Virginia United Methodist conferences, actually Methodist conferences, in which Bishop Francis Asbury, one of the first bishops that our denomination's founder consecrated, held. And that annual conference was 30 days long. When I was in high school, annual conference was about 4.5 or 5 days long. Later, as annual conference would go along, there'd be a little bit of conference fatigue, and you'd see attendance drop. And laity and clergy who would go would take the afternoon or the morning off to sit by the pool. But at annual conference, we are connecting with United Methodists from all over the conference. We are learning what they are doing. We are learning what ministries that we share in common are doing. So there are a lot of reports. There's what's known as the Book of Reports that we get before annual conference that talks about what ministries throughout the conference are doing. And we have business meetings, and we vote on various things that come before us. Now, when it comes to the reporting, because annual conference is considerably shorter than it used to be, many of the reports are just given to us in writing, and some of them are available on the conference website. Technology makes it possible for us to have access to not only written reports, but also videos and other sort of testimony that ministries give about their different areas. But each year, there is a certain theme relating to annual conference. And as a result of that theme, whatever groups are associated with it might have some special presentation. About 11 years ago, the theme for annual conference was young adult and youth ministry. So it featured the youth of the conference and young adults and what's going on in those types of ministries throughout the conference. As a result of that, we had a few extra delegates at annual conference that year. Each district within the Virginia Conference came up with some money to provide scholarships to send young adults to annual conference that year, preferably people who had never been. I was the associate pastor of a larger church in Northern Virginia, and so I got called to ask if there was anybody in the church, 35 or younger, who may be interested in using one of these scholarships. So I contacted a man who was 35 in our church, and I said, if you want to go, they've got this scholarship, and I've already booked my room, so you and I can room together. And I explained to him the nature of what annual conference is and how it's a multiple-day business meeting. And so he was willing to go, but he asked me, he said, so is it just like a really boring 3 days? And if I'm honest, I have to admit, well, yeah, some parts of it can be pretty boring and tedious. But there is a difference when church people get together to do business than just business as usual. The idea of doing business isn't something that is exciting to us. But there's something distinctive about church people who do business. One thing is we have worship and liturgy that pervades the annual conference. There are specific services every year with particular themes. There is a memorial service where they remember clergy and clergy spouses, as well as lay leaders in the conference who have passed away in the previous year. There is a retirement service where the pastors come on stage, and in some conferences, they actually give the pastors a mic and let them say something. In this conference, they ask them to record a 30-second blurb, which is read whenever they are crossing the stage, and pictures of them throughout their ministry are led. There's the service of ordination, whenever those who are being newly ordained are presented with a stole around their necks for the first time, the sign of ordination. There is a service of missions, where missions in the conference and throughout the world are featured as a part of that particular service. And then there is the closing worship service that culminates with the reading off or the presenting of the appointments of all the clergy throughout Virginia. Back in the old days, when most all pastors lived in parsonages that were fully furnished, pastors would not know if they were moving until the last day of annual conference. And then they'd go home and pack up their clothes and hit the road. Thank God we have more advanced knowledge nowadays in order to get our things in order before moving. But worship takes place not only in formal worship settings, but elements of worship also take place during the business meetings as well. Business meetings that include prayer, that include hymn singing, that include testimony, or what Bishop Lewis refers to as glory sightings, signs of what the Holy Spirit is doing throughout Virginia United Methodist. At one of the business sessions, we had this particular form and a number of others that look like it. It looks like a typical spreadsheet with names and addresses and numbers on it. This is something that we looked at when we looked at the churches that were going to be closing, as well as the new church plants that were going to be opening up. And the way in which we address this is one of the things that distinguishes what it means when church people engage in business. Now, I realize this comparison is a bit of a crude simplification here, but you all know the Steak and Shake on Hirschberger Road that closed not too long ago. And I remember seeing a local reporter out in front of the closed down stores say, "We don't know why it was closed," and the corporate office declined our initial request for some kind of a comment. That is something that is very typical in the corporate world. Somebody looking at a spreadsheet somewhere who's never even set foot in Roanoke decides this particular franchise isn't making enough money, so let's just close it down. That's the nature of business as usual. But business among church people is different. Now, there's equal clergy and lay representation at annual conference. There are sessions where we're all together, and there are sessions where we're separated into clergy doing clergy business and laity doing lay business. And at these sessions, we vote to confirm everything. We vote on all of the people who are being ordained, who are about to be ordained. We vote on the list of all those who are being recognized for retirement. We even vote to confirm the name of the clergy who have died in the previous year. I was talking with one of our members and kind of laughing about that. It's like, well, what happens if we don't vote to confirm it? But usually it's somewhat of a formality. If there's any change, it's usually a spelling error or a date that may be wrong. Or occasionally you have a pastor that died very close to annual conference who didn't make it on this sheet. It also signifies that we as United Methodists believe that from the time we are baptized as infants until the time we take our last breath, the larger church is holding account of us and knows where we are and knows what we're doing. Bishop Weaver added a little something extra this year that I greatly appreciated. When we voted on confirming the list of the clergy in the conference who had died in the previous year, he said, now, if there is anyone on this list who has had a significant role in your walk of faith, I want to invite you to stand as we prepared to pray for everybody on the list. And most all of us stood. I stood because I saw the name of Doug Pilla. Doug Pilla was a pastor in this church, in this conference, for many years. He was a very distinguished kind of Virginia gentleman. I mean by that his lips could wrap their way around an O like only a distinguished Virginia gentleman could. He was the pastor of the church in Lynchburg who officiated at the wedding of my dad and my stepmother. And he also had a particular fondness for children who were a part of that church. My niece Annie, who now lives with her family just off of Peters Creek Road, is very petite, and she has always been small. And on the occasions when her grandmother was taking care of her on a weekend and brought her into church, when they were on their way out and going through the narthex, Doug would always pick Annie up and hold her and keep her in his arms for the remainder of the time. One Sunday, Annie was with my stepmother, and they were about to leave the church, and they were going to go out through another door because she had to do something in the fellowship hall. But little Annie protested and said, "Oh, but don't we have to go there and see that man who always talks to us?" So I stood in honor of Doug. Also, we recognized when the entire assembly got together the different churches in the conference that are closing down. When it comes to a church that closes down, that happens when the members of that church vote and decide that they do not have the resources to keep going. It is not a decision that anybody outside of that church ever makes on their behalf, but they decide that for themselves. And Bishop Weaver asked, whenever the names of the churches were given, and they had pictures and they had a testimony about the history of that church, he said, "Now, if any of these churches has affected you in your walk of faith, I invite you to stand." I stood because one of the churches that was on that list was Bassett United Methodist Church. When I was serving in the Danville district, I was trained as a consultant to churches who were having this discussion about where to go next in their ministry. You might remember when I first came here, we did the Choosing the Faithful Path work group. That's a work group that I was trained to oversee to determine the direction a ministry might take. There's another one called Conversation at the Crossroads. That's a more intense 2-hour-long session. And at the end of that session, churches have to decide whether or not they're going to be able to innovate and continue going and do some further study, or whether they need to close the doors. I was the outside consultant who went to Bassett United Methodist Church when they were having that discussion. Back in the day, it was one of the places to go to church in that particular area. Those of you who are familiar with the region know about that, or maybe those of you who have read the book Factory Men. It had the reputation of being the place where wealthy people went to church. It was a grand 2-story facility. But by the time I went there as an outside consultant, they did not have the labor or the funds to keep this huge facility going. They had already shut down the entire upstairs and were not able to use it. The pastor told me that in reserves, they had $35,000, and that was the exact amount of money it was going to take them to replace the furnace to heat the entire facility. They met and they tried what they could, but eventually they decided the church needed to close. So I stood in honor of that church and the small role that I had in relationship to it. At the retirement service this year, we had a sheet of paper front and back with the names and number of years in ministry of all those who were retiring this year. Among those who were retiring was my former district superintendent, from the Danville district. She is someone who is very intelligent and also very tough. She had a great temperament to be a DS. And she wasn't known for taking no for an answer, particularly not from her pastors. I had been continued more than once in going through the ordination process. And she sent me a text and she said, I want to meet with you to discuss your preparations for when you go before the Board of Ordained Ministry next. And I sent her back a text and said, I appreciate that very much. I have a strategy in mind, and I think I'm doing okay. That won't be necessary. And she responded to me with a call that said, I realize you're still processing through that. I'll give you some time. And when you are ready to meet with me, call and we will do that. And we met, and she coached me. She did not say, now I'm going to ask you this, say that. But we talked about Scripture. We talked about my experiences. We talked about the development of my own theology. And she helped me to present myself in a particular way so that I credit her more than anyone else in the Virginia Conference with helping me get to the point when I was able to wear this stole and be ordained. And also, United Methodist pastors are members of the Virginia Conference and not of the particular churches that they serve. That means that DSs are also like pastors to pastors. So she contacted me when she knew Dina was going to be having surgery. And she said, I want to be with you on the day when that happens. And I said to her, I appreciate that, but I know you're very busy, and I think we'll be okay. And she said, I want the date and the time and the hospital where the procedure is going to be going on. And so she came that day. She got there just in time. And she held hands with me and Dina and prayed for the three of us. And she stayed with me throughout the rest of the day. So when we talk about who we are as Methodists, even though we vote on things that look like spreadsheets, it's connected with human beings who have made a deep impact on our lives. So whenever I was voting on these particular issues, I had these people in mind. Whenever I saw the couple stand for Bassett United Methodist Church, the couple I knew that had grown up in that church, that had married and reared their children in that church, the couple who stood for the last act that they would do for that congregation of faith, I knew what the connection was. When the candle was lit and a bell was toned for Doug Pillow, who was being remembered at the memorial service, I remembered the man who had played such a significant role in my life and the life of my family. And when I saw Janine Howard go across the stage that particular day, I realized how influential she was in my life and in getting me where I am. But please don't think that it's all tears and gloom, because there's celebration as well. Because our ministry model comes from the gospel, a view of life that's not life as birth and life and death, but of life, death, and resurrection. So annual conference is very carefully balanced. So as we celebrate what has gone on, we also recognize what is now becoming. We recognize the churches that are closed, and immediately after that, we recognize new church starts. One of which that might be developing here in the Roanoke area at Thrasher Memorial United Methodist Church. They have a congregation that meets in their facility that is Korean. The pastor who started that congregation is a pastor from Korea by the name of Bae Sik Choi. He had his ordination recognized from another denomination's transfer the same year that I was ordained. He was serving two churches down in the Ferrum area, and he met with that church each week. Now, the current associate pastor of Thrasher Memorial, Jesse Moffat, is moving on to serve another church, and their new associate pastor is also a Korean Methodist pastor. So that might eventually lead to the point that you'll have a standalone church that can go off and be in their own facility. Or you may have two very different churches, worshiping in different languages and sharing the same space for mutual times of fellowship. We also recognize that the mission service, mission offerings, and the influence that the Virginia Conference has had on missions throughout the country. So people from other parts of the world give presentations during that service. And they say, our church building stands because a mission team from your conference came and built our church. The physician who is at the health clinic in our community was trained in your colleges, in your universities. And we are able to supply people with affordable medical care because of the financial support that you offer. A few years ago, we had something incredible that happened. The Reverend Pat Watkins was consecrated as a missionary to the environment. Pat Watkins is a very enthusiastic environmentalist, and he was the first ever missionary appointed to serve creation, and he was consecrated a missionary in this particular conference. Every year at annual conference, they give out the Denman Award. It's given out to a pastor, to a church, and also to a youth. Somebody who has made incredible strides in the work and field of evangelism within the Virginia Conference. And now they also have what's known as the Green Church Award. The Green Church is the award given to a church that's made great strides to environmentalism. And those two things of environmentalism and evangelism are not as separate as you might think. Another church that I worked with as a consultant who is doing Choosing the Faithful Path was looking at demographic information for people in that particular area. It's information that comes from Gallup polls that talks about the nature of who lives in that area and what their religious preference might be. I was working with a church in the Manita, Smith Mountain Lake area, and the statistics were a little bit discouraging because of the people who lived in that area, under religious preference, a third of the people who filled out or responded to polls said they were either atheists or agnostic. That means they were people that had absolutely no interest in organized religion. But when that makes up the environment around a church, one thing a church can do is see the way you can get together and work on mutual projects. And so this information included opinions about how strongly people felt about a number of civic issues facing them. And they were all over the place. There was no one particular school of thought for any of these issues except one. And that was 80% of the people said they cared very strongly about the environment. The church that won the Green Church Award this year is Bethlehem United Methodist Church in Manita. It was lay-led, and not only do they care about the environment and the work of creation care, but they realize that in that particular area, that's a way of making connections with people and also evangelizing and reaching out. These are the kinds of things that occur when the church engages in business. We have our meetings, we get together, and we vote. But the difference between church business and business as usual is that every number on this spreadsheet represents a child of God. And every church listed represents the communion of the saints. That is what is distinctive when church people engage in business. Amen.